Good evening and welcome to This Week in Turkey. Tonight we're joined by Faruk Loğoğlu, who is Turkey's former ambassador to Washington, D.C., to talk about how Turkey's foreign policy will be shaped under the country's new executive presidential system following the June 24th elections. Good evening, Mr. Loğoğlu. Welcome to This Week in Turkey.
Thank you.
So Turkey will now operate under a new executive presidential system, one that borrows elements from the US version, but one that's at the same time seemingly different in its own ways. So my first question to you is, as an experienced diplomat and as Turkey's former ambassador to the US, how do you expect this new system to affect Turkey's foreign policy making in the coming period?
I think what we are looking at is a continuation of what has been happening with Turkish foreign policy in the last 3-4 years. That is to say, a foreign policy really ran, formulated and executed by President Erdogan. The difference between then and now is that this is, with the new presidential system, it's now formalized. And Turkish foreign policy will be exclusively in the hands of the president. Yes, we have a foreign minister. Yes, there is a foreign ministry, but they will mostly be responsible for implementing the policy directions decided by President Erdogan. And of course, this is a departure from the traditional way of Turkish foreign policy formulation and implementation, because traditionally in the first 80 years of the Turkish Republic, it was the foreign ministry that basically at least formulated the alternatives, choices, policy choices in Turkish foreign policy. Of course, there was a politically elected foreign minister and a prime minister, a government that made the ultimate determination. But the Turkish foreign policy establishment, the Turkish diplomatic corps, was very effective in formulating and implementing Turkish foreign policy. Now, those are gone. It will be in the hands of President Erdogan to determine both the direction, the choices of Turkey's foreign relations.
So let's get to Turkey's relations with the West now, Mr. Loğoğlu. As you and most other followers of Turkish politics will know by now, that relations with the West have been pretty much noticeably strained in the recent period. Obviously, I'm talking about relations with the US in particular. And the straining of relations happened in a number of areas, including the ongoing civil war in Syria, Turkey's NATO membership, and also a possible arms deal for the purchase of the S-400 air defense systems with Russia. And what should we expect, in your opinion, for the near future? Is a normalization of relations in the cards at all, perhaps?
Look, I think the fact that we have a newly elected president, all countries, East and West, North and South, will wait and to see how this new system in Turkey unfolds. So we are basically looking at a virtual honeymoon period between Turkey and all the countries that have relations with Turkey, but especially the West. I think the Western countries, start with the US and European countries and the European Union, will wait for a while before making a determination about how to deal with the new system in Turkey. Much will depend on what the Turkish government and what President Erdogan does. And I think the litmus test of the direction Turkey will take in the next months and perhaps a few years will be Turkey's relations first with the European Union and then the United States. With the European Union, if there is a mutual effort to take the accession negotiations forward, to make progress, to re-energize the accession negotiations, it will be a good sign. I think President Erdogan has stated during his election campaign that Turkey's commitment to accession, full membership in the European Union is there, and that we are Turkey is committed to this goal of full membership in the European Union. Of course, this will depend a lot on Turkey, but it will also depend on the European Union, whether the European Union will find Erdogan's and Turkey's steps, both domestically and in its foreign policy, as evidence of Turkey's desire to join the European Union, then we can see progress in Turkey-EU relations. Another pillar, of course, another dimension that will make a definitive say about Turkey's position, relations with the West, is Turkey's relations with the United States. There are, as you know, serious bilateral problems, regional issues that really strain that relationship. We can count many. Syria, S-400 decision to buy missiles from Russia, the bilateral issues, extradition issues between Turkey and the U.S., and the strong tendency, critical tendency in the U.S. Congress vis-à-vis Turkey, in fact calling for the stoppage of F-35 aircraft to Turkey. These are all issues that really strain very seriously Turkish-American relations. Now, at the NATO summit, there were brief encounters between President Trump and President Erdogan, but we don't know any details. It was not a formal talk. But I think after the summit between Trump and Putin, the Russian president, we will have some clues as to what might happen in Syria, which is very important for Turkey. But let me say this. For both Turkey and the U.S., the relationship between the two is a very strategic, very important relationship. For a variety of reasons, Turkey's location in the critical region, Turkey's membership in NATO, Turkey's relation with Russia, Turkey's positioning vis-à-vis energy from the Middle East, from Central Asia, from Europe. All these make Turkey an important partner for the U.S. But, as the saying goes, it will take two to tango to really resolve some of the existing problems and to take the relationship forward. It's not going to be easy, but it's possible, and it is in the interest of both Turkey and the United States.
You mentioned this week's NATO summit, Mr. Loğoğlu, so let's conclude on this note, if you will. What do you think about Turkey's future in the NATO in light of the most recent summit that ended yesterday?
Well, it's a good question, and I think from Turkey's point of view, the NATO summit was positive. It gave a positive message to Turkey. In fact, in the summit declaration, there were specific references to Turkey's NATO solidarity with Turkey in countering the threats targeting Turkey from the south, from Syria, and so forth. And this expression of solidarity comes at a time when NATO expressed in the past concern with Turkey's purchase of S-400 missiles from Russia. So I think the NATO summit really said that we are with Turkey, we are with you, we understand your concerns, we understand the security threats against you, an important contribution in NATO, both as an ally in its fight against terrorism in a critical region of the Middle East. So all in all, the NATO summit came out positively from Turkey's point of view. As for the future, I think there's no question that Turkey will remain a member of NATO, and there is no danger or no threat to throw Turkey out of NATO, even though we have seen recent months, perhaps years, articles in the West to that effect. But just think of what Trump said. You know, I think many people felt that Trump was going to really downgrade NATO. He did in terms of defense funding and so forth. And he even said, you know, I can leave NATO. I don't need the U.S. for me to do that. But there is no need to do that. So he too is with NATO. He signed to the declaration, which is a very long, comprehensive declaration covering many issues. So I think NATO solidarity remains intact, and so does Turkey's membership in NATO. Turkey needs NATO, and NATO needs Turkey.
Mr. Loğoğlu, thank you very much for your comments and for being with us tonight.
My pleasure.
Our guest via Skype tonight was Faruk Loğoğlu, Turkey's former ambassador to Washington, D.C., Turkey's former U.S. ambassador, who commented on the directions that Turkey's foreign policy will likely take under the new executive presidential system under the presidency of Recep Tayyip Erdoğan. And now we'll continue with our next news video. The Turkish lira dropped to the 4.97 mark on Wednesday, hitting a new record low against the dollar.
Turkish lira hit a record low against the dollar on Wednesday, nearing 5 lira to the dollar amid a sharp deterioration in investment sentiment. The lira dropped to the 4.97 mark on Wednesday, according to Bloomberg data. The fall pushed the currency below the low of 4.92 on May 23rd, which had ultimately forced the central bank to raise interest rates. The performance of the lira had rallied earlier in the week, following expectations that the re-elected President Recep Tayyip Erdoğan would appoint market-friendly officials to his new cabinet. However, sentiment has worsened after Erdoğan chose his son-in-law Berat Albayrak for the powerful economic post of finance minister. Mehmet Şimşek, the former deputy prime minister who was a familiar face to international investors, was not given a role in the new government. Turkey's new Treasury and Finance Minister Berat Albayrak this week sought to reassure financial markets worried by his appointment and concerned over the independence of the central bank by saying it was unacceptable that its independence is subject to speculation, while vowing the bank would be more effective than ever in the new era. The independence of the central bank and its decision-making mechanisms cannot be subject to speculation, Albayrak was quoted as saying by the state-run Anadolu Agency on Thursday. One of the main aims of our policies in the new period is a central bank that is effective like never before. In the new era, we will support the central bank carrying out a more predictable, straightforward, and decisive monetary policy, he added. Albayrak further noted that their main priority would be reducing inflation with the help of monetary and fiscal policies. This June, consumer prices in Turkey rose 15.39% compared to the same month last year, the Turkish Statistical Institute announced on July 3rd. Albayrak's comments came after Moody's highlighted concern about the independence of the Turkish Central Bank early on Thursday, saying that further challenges to its effectiveness would be negative for Turkey's sovereign rating. In a note to clients, Moody's said changes to the governance of the central bank suggested its resolve to tighten monetary policy could weaken in the coming months. Finance Minister Albayrak's comments helped the lira make up some of its losses from the late Wednesday, trading at 4.8 to the dollar, a gain in value of 2.1% on the day.
Joining us now to comment on the recent performance of the Turkish lira and Turkey's new economic administration is Atilla Yeşilada, who is a prominent Turkish economist and a Turkey analyst at Global Source Partners. Good evening, Mr. Yeşilada. Welcome once again to This Week in Turkey.
Pleasure to be here.
So the Turkish lira, as you know, hit a brand new record low this week on Wednesday, to be exact, and reached almost 5 lira to the dollar. So my first question to you is, why is the lira losing value at the moment? And is there a link between Turkey's new cabinet and the loss in value in the Turkish lira?
Yes, there is a link between the Turkish lira weakness and the new cabinet. There are three reasons. Let me start with the smallest, which is the change in the global backdrop, which is no longer very kind to emerging markets. Money is pulling out of emerging markets. It's not only Turkish lira that's in trouble, it's Argentinian peso, the South African rand, you name it, the Indian rupee. But Turkish lira, I think, is right up there in the worst performers league with Argentinian peso against the dollar. And the more important reason for that is because we are highly leveraged in terms of foreign loans and foreign debt. The math is simple and rather scary. In the next 12 months, Turkey will have to roll over, that is to refinance, roughly $180 billion of maturing foreign debt by private sector as well as the state. On top of that, according to the May balance of payments data, the analyzed current account deficit has reached roughly $60 billion. So Turkey is looking at a refinancing / new financing bill that's roughly $240 billion, or what, 30% of our dollar GDP. And at the time when global financial flows are tightening, Fed is raising interest rates, and massive uncertainty whether the new government intends to do anything to correct this rampant current account deficit, obviously both the creditors and investors are very reluctant to bankroll Turkey's profligate behavior. The final point, and the most important point, that caused Turkish lira weakness, because it was stable for a while, and then after the elections, with the appointment of Mr. Berat Albayrak, the whole thing started over. People started talking about currency crises. It's twofold. One of the first things as executive president Mr. Erdogan did was to amend the central banking law. The amendments are not important, they're rather vague, but in London at Bloomberg TV interview, he said he would take a more active role in monetary policy if he's reelected, so that, people immediately put one and one together and thought, rightly or wrongly, I honestly don't know, that from now on it would be Mr. Erdogan running monetary policy behind the scenes. And Mr. Erdogan has this bizarre interest rate theory which no one subscribes to except his advisors in the palace, which is that interest rates lead inflation. That is, if you raise the interest rates, inflation rises as well. The problem with Berat Albayrak is he replaces a relatively experienced team of Mr. Şimşek and Naci Ağbal, both of whom were instrumental in stabilizing the lira by promising investors that once elections are out of the way, Turkey will return to fiscal discipline, tight monetary policy, and structural reforms. Now, clearly, Mr. Berat Albayrak is not bound by these on the foreigners trying to undermine Turkey via financial manipulation, and how Turkey can grow endlessly. So instead of a team of relatively orthodox thinkers, Mr. Albayrak coming to power also raised fears that he would essentially execute his boss's strange theories in terms of the economic realm. And instead of adopting measures to reduce inflation and current account deficits, growth will be prioritized once again. And Turkey will have a hard landing simply because we can't grow anymore. Obviously, the engine is overheated. It's about to burst.
So, Mr. Yeşilada, you've already started talking about the exclusion of Mehmet Şimşek in the new cabinet and the appointment of Berat Albayrak, Erdogan's son-in-law, as the minister, for Treasury and Finance. But what's your overall evaluation of Turkey's new economic administration? In other words, what message or signal does this new cabinet send to the markets?
Well, first of all, since his appointment, Mr. Berat Albayrak made all the right noises. He, for instance, revealed a 6-point action plan which promises to restore, fiscal austerity or fiscal discipline, bring growth to a moderate tempo, and fight inflation. Bringing inflation down to single digits will be the first priority. This is all good, but we need to see the action. I am happy with the cabinet, to be perfectly honest with you. I think bringing in experienced professionals from the private sector is a new experiment that's worth trying. Technocratic cabinets are not necessarily bad. To the extent I have viewed the resumes of the ministers, they're all competent people in their own fields who can make a huge contribution to policy. I am also, in general, sanguine about these new agencies and directorates which are going to be making or advising on strategic policy matters. What really bothers me is how all of these fit together. Clearly, Mr. Erdogan has this new blueprint of an architecture in his mind, but how the cabinet, these agencies, and his advisors in the palace fit together, who supersedes whom, whether they are administrative or purely advisory, who will get Mr. Erdogan's ear, and whether these institutions will be transparent in terms of what they're saying to Erdogan, are very important matters. I really hate to be vague when, I am on TV, but I don't know the answers. The best I can say is that I'm going to be watching this transformation very closely. I'm not necessarily negative towards it. I think a lot of positives can come out of it. Decision making by committee is always my favorite. But on the other hand, we all should realize the downside risk that such a radical change in Turkish bureaucracy and administrative structure could completely confuse the civil service and the business community and lead to chaos, paralysis, and further undermining of sentiment.
And to conclude, Mr. Yeşilada, how likely is lira's loss in value to be reversed in the coming period, or to ask it in a different way, is there any room for optimism for the Turkish lira, in your opinion?
Not until after the March local elections. I mean, again, I am willing to extend credit to Mr. Berat Albayrak. He's a young man, he has a finance background, he can learn very quickly. But let's face it, I mean, this is a democratic country and local elections are crucial in the sense that AKP lost 7 percentage points in general elections. According to Konda, a survey agency, which had one of the better forecasts regarding election outcomes, if the trends don't change, Erdogan could lose Istanbul and Ankara, which are, and if he loses those two cities, AKP may lose power in the next general elections. And the problem is the voters need to be fed. They are used to patronage and pork barreling. I don't think any government, any democratic government, can do much in terms of belt tightening or the kind of preemptively tight monetary policy that will bring down inflation expectations. So Turkey will do the minimum that would prevent an attack on Turkish assets. That's to stop foreign investors from leaving Turkey, but not enough to help stabilize the Turkish lira. As well, we're heading into very choppy seas. The American economy is gaining strength. It will be hurt by the trade wars, but not in the sense that most people interpret it. Trade wars will not affect American economic growth. It will increase American inflation, which might mean Fed will have to raise interest rates faster than currently anticipated. The ECB is fairly clear that despite some weakness in the economy and the downside introduced by the prospect of trade wars, it's not going to change its plans of ending bond buying by the end of the year and monetary normalization in 2019. The Turkish economic miracle is a product of the QE era, of endless money printing era. And that printing press has stopped, and the huge lake of liquidity is drying. So in addition to elections, we also have to deal with the longer-term structural change of tighter global financial conditions. It is really difficult to see a scenario where Turkish lira appreciates unless Erdogan completely delegates power to the likes of Ali Babacan or invites IMF to draw up a program that will overhaul the Turkish economic model.
Thank you very much, Mr. Yeşilada, for being with us tonight and for your comments.
Have a good weekend. Bye-bye.
So our second guest via Skype tonight was prominent Turkish economist Atilla Yeşilada, who commented on the recent performance of the Turkish lira in light of the new cabinet announced by President Recep Tayyip Erdogan in the beginning of this week. And now we'll continue with our next news video. President Recep Tayyip Erdogan announced the new ministers of his cabinet on Monday.
President Recep Tayyip Erdogan announced on Monday the new ministers of his cabinet, as Turkey has now officially switched to an executive presidency. Erdogan appointed Chief of General Staff General Hulusi Akar as a new defense minister, and his son-in-law Berat Albayrak as a treasury and finance minister in a 16-seat surprise cabinet with little-known bureaucratic figures, hours after he was sworn into office on Monday. Erdogan's vice president is Fuat Oktay, former undersecretary of the Office of the Prime Minister, who is regarded as one of the architects of the bureaucratic and administrative transformation after the governmental system has been shifted into presidency through last year's referendum. Erdogan hasn't named any Nationalist Movement Party MHP members as ministers, despite their alliance in parliament helping him retain majority control of the chamber. Erdogan opted to continue with current Justice Minister Abdülhamit Gül, Interior Minister Süleyman Soylu, and Foreign Minister Mevlüt Çavuşoğlu in the new cabinet. As Interior Minister, Süleyman Soylu has overseen the operations conducted by the security forces against the outlawed Kurdistan Workers' Party, PKK, in Turkey. He is known for his heated speeches against the pro-Kurdish opposition People's Democratic Party, HDP, and its members, who are accused of having links to the PKK. All of the newly appointed ministers will have to resign from the parliament to join the cabinet. Meanwhile, the new trade minister will be Ruhsar Pekcan, a businesswoman who has been serving at Turkey's largest trade chamber as the deputy head for women's entrepreneurship and at the Foreign Economic Relations Board, DEİK. Mustafa Varank, one of the closest aides of Erdogan, will serve as the Industry and Development Minister in the new cabinet. Undersecretary of the Energy Ministry, Fatih Dönmez, is appointed as the new Energy Minister, while Cahit Turan, former head of the Directorate of Highways, will serve as the Transportation and Infrastructure Minister. Education Minister Ziya Selçuk has long served at the Education Ministry, but he is well known as the owner of a private college in Turkey. Under the new government system of Turkey, the president is both the head of state and government, with the prime minister's post abolished. Turkish ministers will now be reporting to the president, and no longer to the parliament, as it was in the old system.
Turkey was represented by President Recep Tayyip Erdoğan, Foreign Minister Mevlüt Çavuşoğlu, and National Defense Minister Hulusi Akar at the NATO summit in Brussels this week.
The two-day annual NATO summit was held on Wednesday and Thursday in Brussels. The main agenda of the summit was the national defense spending, the fight against terrorism, and modernizing the alliance's command structure. The US President Donald Trump slammed his allies early in the summit, demanding that the leaders immediately pour billions of dollars into their military budgets. Turkey was represented at the summit by President Recep Tayyip Erdoğan, Foreign Minister Mevlüt Çavuşoğlu, and National Defense Minister Hulusi Akar. While addressing the leaders of member countries during the summit, Minister Çavuşoğlu responded to the criticisms of Turkey's purchase of Russian S-400 missile defense system. Çavuşoğlu blamed the NATO allies for failing to meet Turkey's demands for critical weapon systems. Turkey tried to buy air defense systems from its allies and the US for the past 20 years. It's my urgent need, and I tried to buy from many other countries, including China. But I get the best deal from Russia, and I bought it, Çavuşoğlu said. After the first day of the summit, NATO pledged to provide essential measures for Turkey against potential challenges from Syria. Tailored assurance measures for Turkey to respond to the growing security challenges from the south contribute to the security of the alliance as a whole and will be fully implemented, the NATO statement read. Meanwhile, President Recep Tayyip Erdoğan held bilateral talks with Greek Prime Minister Alexis Tsipras, Italian Prime Minister Giuseppe Conte, Ukrainian President Petro Poroshenko, and Bulgarian President Rumen Radev on the sidelines of the summit. Greece and Turkey have agreed to focus efforts on easing tensions in the Aegean Sea, Greek Prime Minister Alexis Tsipras said after the meeting with Erdoğan. On the final day of the summit, Erdoğan also met with French President Emmanuel Macron.
The head of Okan University's Department of International Relations, Zeynep Alemdar, reported from the NATO summit in Brussels for Mediascope yesterday.
So what rests to us from this NATO summit in Brussels in 2018? I guess we have to look at the dynamics of the world, and whatever happens with the Trump's tantrums or whatever happens that really takes the attention of the international media, we should probably be more careful and look at the communique, the declaration of the summit that was out yesterday. And it looks like, although now there's an emergency meeting in the NATO summit, it looks like the defense ministers have already agreed on the communique. So we don't think that there will be any changes to that. And what rests to us is, of course, the question of NATO's budget and who's going to be handling it, who's going to be carrying the heavy weight, and also. I think one of the most important things that has been discussed was the democracy issue, of course. What is going to happen? Is NATO going to be a defender of the liberal democratic values or not? One of the discussions that was going on was actually NATO-EU relationship and whether NATO should actually step up to become an actor in forging, more liberal norms within its member states. So I guess in the future days, that is going to be one of the discussions.
The imprisoned American pastor Andrew Brunson's third hearing will be held next week on July 18th.
The United States has focused on the release of Andrew Brunson, the jailed American pastor who has been in prison for more than 20 months on terror charges, in order to make further progress in other areas of cooperation between Ankara and Washington. Brunson's next hearing, which will be the third, is scheduled for next week on July 18th. U.S. Embassy Charge d'Affaires Philip Kosnet said there is a strong sense of unity in Congress between Republicans and Democrats on the release of the American pastor. There is a similar sense of unity between Congress and the administration that in order for the relationship between Turkey and the U.S. to progress, we need to resolve that status, not only for Brunson, but also for other American citizens and local Turkish employees of U.S. missions, who we feel are detained unjustly under the state of emergency, Kosnet said in Ankara when asked about the outcome of a recent visit of senators to Ankara for release of the pastor. two senior members of the United States Senate, Lindsey Graham and Jean Şahin, paid a previously undisclosed trip to the Turkish capital on June 29th to meet President Recep Tayyip Erdoğan in a direct appeal for Brunson's release. Şahin, a Democrat senator from New Hampshire and a member of the Senate Foreign Relations and Armed Services Committees, is the most vocal member of the US Senate for sanctioning Turkey over the detention of Pastor Brunson. One of her congressional actions includes imposing a ban on the delivery of the F-35 aircrafts to Turkey. Şahin and Graham, a Republican senator from South Carolina, also visited Pastor Brunson in prison in the Ali Ağa district of Izmir before they were received by Erdoğan. Both governments are completely committed to rebuilding their relationship by overcoming significant issues that have come up in the US-Turkey relationship and are committed to re-establishing the partnership that has served both countries for many decades, Graham said. US Embassy Charge d'Affaires underlined, starting at the very top, from President Trump and President Erdoğan, there are very strong signals that rebuilding the Turkish-American relationship is an important priority.
Our friend Sinan Akgünay did an interview this week with the International Crisis Group's senior Russia analyst, Anna Arutunyan, on their recent report on Russia-Turkey relations in the Black Sea and South Caucasus.
Well, what essentially happened in the last couple of years is that the downing of a Russian jet over Turkish airspace brought these two powers extremely close to conflict, and that led to, that led to a danger of a military conflict, obviously, but both sides struggled to contain it, and eventually they succeeded. Moreover, they reconciled afterward, because I think that Ankara and Moscow realized that they had more, it was more convenient for them to be friends in Syria than to be enemies. I think that was a very pragmatic step. So since then, their ties have renewed. Putin and Erdogan met 10 times since the souring of relations. Trade and most of the sanctions have been lifted. Trade has been restored, and two are cooperating quite significantly on Syria.
Now let's take a look at what's on in Istanbul next week.
French movies are now being screened at Zorlu PSM's amphitheater. From July 16th to September 10th, film lovers will have the chance to enjoy a selection of French films every Monday night at Zorlu PSM's amphitheater in cooperation with the French Institute, and the screenings will be free of charge. This Monday's film, 9 Month Stretch, was awarded the Best Actress and Best Original Screenplay at Caesar Awards and tells the story of a young woman's unexpected pregnancy in a conservative society. A great example of dark French comedy, the movie features Terry Gilliam, Gaspard Noé, and Jean Dujardin as cameos.
Ariane, ce qui vous amène?
C'est pour une recherche de paternité.
Led Zeppelin's legendary voice Robert Plant will perform as part of the Istanbul Jazz Festival with his band The Sensational Shapeshifters on Tuesday at the Harbiye Cemil Topuzlu Open Air Stage. Robert Plant, one of the undisputedly magnificent voices and band leaders in rock music history, will play songs from his latest album, Carry Fire, in addition to his classics.
That's all from This Week in Turkey. Thanks for tuning in and hope to see you again next Friday at 9 p.m. Goodbye.